Hello again. In this podcast, I thought I'd talk about something that I was actually inspired by a post in Facebook. I think it was yesterday, actually. Doesn't really matter. But it's about mood. And by that, I'm not talking about how you get up in the morning, but I'm talking about how we would describe perhaps a photograph or an image that has or perhaps promotes an emotional reaction in us. So when we look at a particular photograph, the photographer is perhaps trying to convey or initiate a particular emotional reaction in the viewer. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about mood. And the particular photographs that I saw, it was just a collection that this person had done. And they were all urban kind of shots. They were just street shots. They were shot at night in fog. Normally one person at least in the frame, but generally not center, and one or more street lights sort of amongst the fog. And I really liked it as an image, and I want to talk a little bit about why and how you can think about creating that kind of shot, something that elicits a mood in the viewer, and the tools that you have as a photographer as you're constructing the photograph to do that, and also what kind of emotional response you're trying to create in the viewer as well, because it doesn't all have to be, let's say, contemplative or fearful or anything like that. You can also have quite happy moods. So there's different ways you can do that, and I want to talk about how that's done and perhaps give you some food for thought, something that you can try out yourself and see how you go with it. So really, there are, I think, two main elements, or let's say kind of headings that the composition would come under. And then within that, there are more details. So the two headings, let's call them, are light and how you use the light in the shot. And then the other one is space. So looking at light, first of all, how you use light. And here I'm talking about contrast. I'm talking about shadow. I'm talking about all of those elements that create how the image looks from the perspective of the brightness and light. So you might have an image that's very dark. This might be a portrait. It might be an urban shot. Could be anything. But it's basically quite dark, and your subject is lit by comparison. Maybe not fully lit, but partially lit. So if it was a portrait, for example, you might have half the face in darkness or in shadow, and the other half is lit. So you've got an unusual shot. Or it might be a profile photograph of somebody where the background is completely black. Now, these don't have to necessarily be black and white. And again, I'm kind of throwing color in under the light heading. So black and white is definitely very powerful because it has that abstract quality to it. We don't see in black and white. And so any normal scene that we look at that's in black and white immediately becomes slightly abstract, because black and white photographs and images are all about shapes and textures. So we're looking at the shape of the object, and also textures will be brought out in black and white photographs, black and white images, in the way that they wouldn't necessarily be if they were in color. And in fact, the color can be a distraction. There's a quote, and I'll paraphrase it because I can't quite remember it, and I've forgotten who said it, but it was something about if I take a portrait of somebody in color, I'm photographing their clothes. If I take a portrait of them in black and white, I'm photographing their soul. And there's definitely a very different feel, a different mood, if you like, to a portrait, let's say, of somebody that's in black and white compared to exactly the same image in color. And if you don't believe me, I just have a go. Take a color photograph of somebody and just take all the color out, and then perhaps experiment with some of the other things I'm going to talk about and see how your response to that image changes. And this is really what I'm talking about. And as I say, I think this is a very powerful tool that we have at our disposal if we think about it. And if we're trying to create photographs that have a real impact, there are things we can do that at least heighten the chances of creating an emotional response. So we've got the light. So obviously that would we're talking about things like the amount of exposure. Is it overexposed, underexposed? Are certain areas of the frame brightly lit? Are they dimly lit? Do they have no lighting at all? Are they completely dark? How do we use shadow? So shadow in the street images that I'm talking about was also another element of how that photographer had put them together. So look at the shadows that you have naturally if you're doing that kind of a shot, and look at how you can use them. But also on top of that, of course, is contrast. And that's probably the key thing that you'll be working with to get really high impact. Because if you think about it, if you have a low contrast shot, so again, if we look at this from a black and white perspective, you've got your blacks, you've got your whites, but you've got a lot of grayscale in between. And you can clearly see elements of the different grayscales as you look at the photograph. And if you take that same photograph and then increase the contrast. So essentially what you're doing is removing the amount of grayscale that you have. And so the blacks and the whites are much stronger and much more dominant in the image than they were previously. How does that change the image? How does that change the feel of the image? And of course, another thing you can do with that is to change the grain. So again, in the days of film, when I started, I would sometimes deliberately pick a very grainy film to get a particular feel. Normally, they'd be the much higher ISO, which would tend to be much bigger grain. Or conversely, you can go for a very small grain, a very fine image, so a much slower rating, and that would give you a very it's a very detailed, very kind of high definition image. So obviously with today's digital cameras, we can just do that in the camera. So, and then again in post-processing, we can emphasize the amount of grain in the image. So having a very grainy image is another way of changing the mood of that image, or having something that's very, very fine grained. So you can't see any grain at all. It's just very crisp blacks and whites and maybe grays in there. But that again has a different mood to it than something that's very grainy. So that's just another element within that broad area of, let's say, contrast, but grain would be in addition to contrast. But they will have a big impact on how that photograph feels when somebody looks at it. And I'm going to jump into something else that I often talk about, and that's the storytelling aspect. So you may have heard me talk about the visual storyteller. If you haven't, then please do. There is definitely at least one podcast about that, probably more than one. And I definitely refer to it quite often because that's the approach I use when I take photographs. And it automatically eliminates several of the kind of common problems that many people have with their photography. But the reason it's so important is that we are natural storytellers. And if you think back a few hundred years, it's very easy to picture a group of people sat around a campfire at night or a fire in a home, wherever it is, sharing stories. If you go back a little further, this was what histories were, to use the perhaps the earlier meaning of that term. Histories were about telling stories. And in fact, the mark of a good storyteller was to add their own spin on a story that had been passed down to them. So as you go through the generations, each generation is adding their own little twist, their own little spin to a story. But that was how history started. It's not what we would regard as history these days, which is all about facts and figures. But that was how all of that started. And if you go back even further to the days, and here I'm talking thousands, tens of thousands of years, to things like cave paintings. If you think about those, whether it's somebody just spraying or spitting paint onto their hand, which is held up against a rock and they get the outline of the hand, or somebody's drawn an animal, maybe with a stick figure chasing it. These are all stories. And obviously they had a very specific meaning to the people who wrote those stories. And as time goes on, those meanings can change. And the reason I say all of this is that if we're not clear on a story, we will tend to create our own story, because that's what we do. People love stories. It's why Hollywood's so popular, TV, all the rest of it, books before that. We love stories. So you can do that in a photograph by using the second heading that I was talking about, which is space. So where you position your subject and what you do with the space around them it will have a big effect and a big impact on that person who is viewing that image. And again, if you don't believe me, just try taking a shot with a subject that pretty much fills the frame, and then try the same subject, but much, much smaller in the frame. So they're a very small part of the frame. And look at the difference. And particularly if you take the subject out of the center, doesn't have to. I mean, this is, we do our own thing. There are guidelines in this case, not rules. It's all very subjective. But if you put your subject over to one side, or perhaps down in a corner, and have a lot of space, what is that space doing for the viewer? So as an example, if you, and this actually is something I see quite often in television these days, in more modern dramas, they'll often have a headshot of somebody speaking, but they're over in, let's say, the right-hand part of their frame, and then looking out of that right-hand edge of the frame. So there's a whole, maybe 2/3 of the frame behind their head, which has just background in it, or it might be out of focus or something. But what's going on, if you know what I'm talking about, what's going on when you look at a picture like that? Subconsciously, we're waiting for something to happen in that area. Maybe we're expecting someone or something to come from behind. Maybe it's pointing towards the past rather than something physical behind them. But this is where the subconscious will try and fill in the gap. So I've heard this referred to as negative space. It's not something I like, because to me, negative is just something that takes away, whereas this space is actually adding to the whole mood of the shot, because subconsciously, at least, and maybe even consciously, we're beginning to fill in that space. We're thinking about why that space is there in relation to the subject. And obviously, if you did that the other way around, so that the space is in front of your subject, whether that's a moving car, a running animal, a portrait where somebody's looking into the space, what is that doing? And you can probably answer this question anyway, in regards of what it means to you. But what is that space creating? Is this something in the future? Is this somewhere they're going? This is the kind of thing that we get when we begin to play with space. So, I mean, one of the things I did quite deliberately with a wildlife photograph when I was in South Africa, I was on a hill on the edge of a little valley, and on the other side, the hill on the other side of the valley, it was covered in trees, but there was a small clearing, and there was an elephant in that clearing. And because of the distance, it looked quite small. And I deliberately took a shot. I did it in portrait format, had the elephant quite low down in the frame and over to the left. And the frame was mostly filled with trees. And that did two things, at least to my mind. One of them was to show the context, the kind of countryside that elephant was in, where it was living. And secondly, it was to try and make the point that the elephants, we think of elephants as being big things, which they are next to us. But if you have something that's big in a very small space, or it looks very small in the space, then it begins to talk about the significance and maybe how big they really are compared to something else. There was another frame I remember. This was from the James Cameron movie Titanic, if you've seen that one. There is one frame of the ship. It's getting dark, or it's at night, so the lights are on in the ship, but it's just obviously digitally created, but it's kind of a long shot of the ship, and most of the frame is made up of the ocean. And again, making the point that this ship, which was I think the largest ocean liner at the time by a few inches, how small and insignificant it really is when you compare it to the ocean, and obviously the power of the ocean and what's in the ocean in relation to the story of what happened to that ship. So the reason for talking about all of this is to just try and make the point that how you use space in your photography is just as important as what you're doing with the subject, because you can create something that perhaps is different to how other people would normally shoot that subject, be it a person, an animal, something else. So think about those techniques. So again, just to recap, I guess, the main things I've been talking about, let's start with the light. So what's bright and what's dark in the frame? How are you using contrast? Contrast, I think, is really important to get a high impact image. So how you're using the contrast. How are you using color? So are you going black and white? Are you going for a color shot? And then how saturated are those colors? Because if you create a very highly saturated image, that can create quite a happy feel. If you think about it, if you've got something that's, a happy childhood memory, you might want that in very bright colors because it's kind of uplifting, kind of lifts the spirit to see that photograph. So think about that. And equally, if you desaturate the colors, then what's the effect of the overall image there? If you play with contrast and saturation, they will have a very big impact on how that image feels. So that's two aspects of it. Another one is the grain. So this is, again, something I like to play with on occasion, just deliberately make something very grainy. And also there are certain shots I want to take where I want no grain at all. I want them to be very high resolution, very sharp, very crisp. And that also has if you think of the same image with virtually no grain against the same image with a lot of grain, how do they feel? What's the difference between them? And again, I'll let you answer that question. Hopefully there is a difference, but these are the kind of things to think about. I've then spoken about how you use space. So again, that's really important where you put the subject. So you'll no doubt be familiar with the rule of thirds. If not, my training course will tell you all about it, but I've also spoken about it in webinars. And there are also other composition techniques you can use. So it's not just rule of thirds, there are others too. And what impact are they having on the viewer? How are you taking them on a journey through the image that you have? Are you creating a lot of empty space against the subject? Is the subject pretty much filling the frame? Is it much more about impact, being very, very close to that subject? Maybe even a close-up might be the image is mostly somebody's eye or an animal's eye, or their mouth or a tooth or whatever it might be. So you can take any element of your subject and really zoom in tight onto that. And that might, with the view to saying something about that animal. So if you say zoom in on the teeth, then that might be a predator. I'm thinking predator here, but it obviously doesn't have to be. But that will send one kind of a message to the person who's viewing the image. Whereas if you do a close-up on the eyes, that can be something quite different. And again, with an eye shot, what's the color? How are you using color? How are you using light? How are you using contrast? How are you using shade? All of those things. So hopefully you're getting some thoughts and some ideas on things that you can try with perhaps your next shoot or when you next go out, with just, first of all, on the composition itself. So where you're putting your subject in relation to the frame and other things in the frame, and then what you do in post-processing, how you're going to use color, contrast, maybe you want to even deliberately defocus. I tend to do that in the camera. That's the way I operate. I like to set my depth of field and go from there. But how you set the depth of field is also very revealing, because if you have a subject, again, let's say a person, and their eye is sharp, that's what I generally go for, and the background, you can see something in the background, but it's not clear. Does that mean that for that person, that thing, whatever it is in the background, is something that they're not aware of? Or do you want to make the background sharper? Do you want to show a threat? So maybe the focus is on actually the background object and not the subject. Let's say, again, person close to the camera, they're out of focus or slightly out of focus, and you've got this subject. So, for example, I took a photograph of, I think it was a wildebeest calf. It had been prancing along past some bushes down to where this group of wildebeest were. And what it was blissfully unaware of were two lions who were just sitting close to where I was, behind one of these bushes. And the wildebeest, I think, had no idea they were there because they didn't move. And although wildebeest have that kind of sight to the sides, I think because the lions, weren't moving, it was probably completely unaware that they were there. So, but again, by taking that shot with the focus on the wildebeest, but with one of the lions in the foreground, but slightly out of focus, I'm trying to make the point that, yeah, that's the focus. It's the young wildebeest, but there is a threat there. And because it's out of focus, is saying, or to me at least, and we all interpret in our own ways, but to me it's saying that little calf isn't aware of the real threat that sits there to its life only a few meters away. So these are the kind of things we can play with. Okay, so that really covers pretty much everything I wanted to talk about, at least for now, in mood. I find it a very interesting topic. I used to use it a lot when I would do, certainly on photo walks where I was doing urban photography. I'd play it a lot because often we would do those in the evening, and you get to the winter months, so you're doing it at night. And you can play around with lights, headlights, street lights, all those kind of things can have an impact on the final image that you come up with, and it can look quite different to what you're seeing with your eye. And hopefully in doing that, you've got something that's of interest to the viewer because it's a perspective, a view they haven't seen before, maybe haven't even thought of before, and that will engage them with that particular image. Okay, so on that note, I will wind it up there. Thanks very much for listening. I hope you found it useful, and I'll speak to you in the next podcast. Bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 Wildlife Calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.